Hey, what's up everybody, this is Meyer, and in this video what I want to do is walk through the percussion of this remix of Walk Away that I have with Asher, Postman, and Annalisa Franklin. I know a lot of you guys were asking me about how I did the percussion, so I wanted to kind of go through that. And the percussion in this track is actually really simple, so this will be a quick video, and this isn't the most advanced percussion work I've ever done in a track. In fact, this is pretty quick and dirty. This is the first track I ever did in Ableton Live, so as a result, I was still kind of feeling my way through how it worked and still making a lot of mistakes that I haven't made since then. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. The part of the percussion that I really want to do, and let me go ahead and mute these vocals so my video doesn't get flagged. That's a vocal, I believe this, oh no, sorry. This is the vocal channel. But the part that I want to look at is this section here, this part 2 of the drop, and we can also look at the intro and outro. Yeah, so let's go ahead and look at what's going on here. So I've kind of split it up into a drums group, which has really 4 elements: a clap, an open hi-hat, a ride, and a closed hat. And then this loops group, which features some of these loops which are from the original track from the stems, and then basically 3 additional loops that I will go through and talk about. And I think I muted this one, so I guess this one's not even doing anything. I think I didn't like the way it sounded time stretch, so I just turned it off. So really it's 3 loops and 4 elements. So the most important element in uplifting trance, in my opinion, is the open hi-hat, and I cannot stress enough how much of the drive this adds. Let me play this section of the track without it, and I'll add it back in and you'll hear exactly what I mean. I mean, that really adds the most drive and is the most important part. Now, usually you'd think if it's the most important, I'd have it on the top of the drums group, but I kind of do it by nature of how complicated the MIDI is. So the clap, that's every other beat. The open hi-hat is every beat, but on the off beats. The ride, I generally tend to use an open, kind of like the same MIDI as the open hi-hat, so on the off beats, but you don't have to do that. And then the closed hat is just doing every 16th notes. So this starting with the open hi-hat, what this is a simple sample. This is from the Dave Parkinson amplified pack, and all it's doing is going through the this EQ, which take out a lot of the low end, and I'm cutting off a little bit of the highs because I didn't want it to be too shrill. So let me go ahead and play it with, and I'll add each of these things onto them. Now this auto filter and this utility, this is just volume automation throughout the track when I'm fading it in and out, and this is just fading the high frequency in and out. So these aren't really part of the main percussion, they're more for the intro and outro. So take a listen. So let me add this EQ. Now this EQ, by taking out a lot of this low end, which isn't really adding anything to me, it almost makes it sound like the hi-hat itself is pitched up, and that's because it doesn't have these fundamental frequencies that are in the original sample, which is mainly just kind of, I don't want to say mud, because sometimes you want that, but for this track, there's so much going on. There's these leads and plucks, and the vocals all taking up this space here that I didn't want the open hat interfering. And then what's doing a lot of the work is this Ssl Eq with this hi-hat preset that I modified. Let me do it here. So really just adding a little bit of high frequency, high mid, and taking out some of the low mids. But what it does is it kind of seems to almost act, and maybe this is because it's an analog modeling plugin from Waves, it almost seems to act like it's doing some dynamics, like some transient shaping or some compression or something like that. So I really like what that's doing. So that's the open hat. Now let's take a look at the clap. Clap is pretty simple. It's this, I guess, also from the Dave Parkinson amplified pack. This EQ is super important. And then, so what's going on? This EQ is taking out some of this this low mid information, or not low mid. It's, I guess, just high mid. But I didn't want to take it out completely because I thought it sounded tinny. Take a listen. If I play it back here. So I just thought that, you know, you hear it when I bring this band back up, it kind of gives it almost more of a muddy flavor, whereas I wanted just the clap to take care of the high end, because once again, leads and vocals and things are all going to be occupying this area. And what this compressor is doing, notice how I use New York style compression, where I'm using the dry wet on the compressor itself at about 50%, but this is really just emphasizing the first 13 milliseconds. So you can see there might be a couple dB of gain reduction, and as what's going on here is it's letting that initial transient of the clap through and then clamping down on the rest of this. So that's kind of just clamping down on this. You can kind of hear it if I play it again. To me, it just makes it a little slight bit snappier. So that's what I'm doing with that. Next up is the ride cymbal. This is pretty simple, also from the Dave Parkinson amplified pack. And simple EQ, and this compressor is just to even out the dynamics, because I kind of wanted it to be a little bit flatter. So I'll play this, and then I'll take these guys off and add them one by one. So a couple things that are going on here. First of all, this is just taking out some of the mud and taking out some of the high end, because since this is being layered with the open hat, and I'll play those two together, I didn't want the high end getting too shrill with the open hat playing, so I cut that off. And this compressor is really doing a lot to the sound. Now what it's doing here is, if you notice this ride, it has a big initial transient and then it kind of dies off with this tail. So what I'm trying to do with this compressor is some pretty aggressive gain reduction to not let too much of that transient through. Notice how the attack is 2 milliseconds, so that's gonna really clamp down pretty quickly, and then it just is really clamping down on the sound to kind of even it out, because these rides in uplifting, when you hear them like this, they almost form this sort of metallic texture over the top of the track. So by kind of taking out those dynamics, it's kind of giving it a little bit a little bit of pumping. And in tech trance, you'll even hear they'll use like LFO tool or some sidechain to kind of really duck it when that kick is playing. But listen to it with the open hi-hat. So basically what this compressor is doing is making sure that this isn't too transient-like, because the open hi-hat itself is very much adding that transient. And in fact, I use this sort of envelope on the open hi-hat to take out some of to give it more of an envelope that, if you notice what's going on with the volume, the open hi-hat hits, this is the transient, and then it kind of fades out. So it's actually not, the envelope is going to look like this, and then it's going to die out at this second section. So this is kind of adding that initial transient, and then the ride comes in, and I like doing this in the second 16 bars of the drop, where you bring in the ride to kind of give it that extra texture on top of the open hi-hat to just increase the energy a little bit more. And last but not least, we have a closed hi-hat. Pretty simple. Now, if you look at the MIDI for this closed hi-hat, notice how it's just pretty much straight 16th notes. I don't think I applied, I did apply a little bit of a groove to it, so I use the groove pool here. So you notice these aren't exactly on the 16th note grid, so it's a little bit swung, and that kind of helps when it's played with the mid bass. But let me solo this, and I'll add everything in. And this LFO tool is what's really doing this, the sort of the groove, or giving it that transient where the first one doesn't come in with the kick. You got your middle one layered with the open hi-hat, so it's gonna hit here. Whoops, let's go back. Here, 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 and here. So, and this last one's kind of getting cut off. So these are the 4 16th notes that are playing, and then it's getting kind of cut off in that way. And then last but not least, we have this auto filter here to filter it out when we're not playing it. So take a listen, and then this LFO tool you'll really hear adds that groove. And this EQ8, what this is doing, which is really important, is taking out a lot of that low mid, which once again, kind of similar to that clap or the open hi-hat, almost makes it sound like it's being pitched up, which is interesting because I actually pitched the sample down a semitone. I thought it just sounded a little bit better in key with that. The other thing I think I did here, let me see if I did it. Yes, I added this in the sampler, this random panning. So if you notice, this is kind of panning around the stereo field, and this is done randomly each time the note is triggered. So notice how my closed hi-hat is centered right down the center, but if you notice, this randomness is causing it to bounce to the left and right. Just kind of each note is going to hit randomly in a different area. So that's kind of, I think, pretty helpful just for adding a little bit of variation. You'll also see people using things like auto pans to pan it left and right, but for this one I just did a little bit of that randomness. Now listen to this closed hat with the bass line, you'll end the kick, because you'll hear how it's not quite on the grid, but it gives it a little bit extra groove and I think fattens up the sound. So once again, you hear it's a little late. The hi-hat itself is a little late, but it's not so late. I mean, it's just like, you know, really, really slightly late. But it gives it that little bit of extra groove, and it keeps the transient of this closed hat from overlapping too much with the transient of these bass lines. I don't think that's too much of a consideration for me, but it just ended up working. So that's it for pretty much the percussion. Let me move on to these 3 loops. So once again, these guys are disabled. They're not doing anything. The first loop is this loop I found from the Adam Ellis amplified sample pack, and this is an amazing, amazing sample. I really like the way this sounds. So what's going on with this? I've actually chopped up the loop using Live's slicer. I don't think I really did anything, and then just rolled off the high end. So let's go ahead and see what all these things are doing. So take all this off. This gain plugin is just there for our volume automation. This is darkening it a little bit just because this closed hat and open hat both are very bright, so I wanted this to be out of the way from those things. Then we have this phaser, which is just there to add a little bit of movement. For all these loops, you'll see there are a lot of techniques you can use for causing these loops to be a little bit more interesting and more dynamic. So you can use things like phasers, like auto filters to scoop out the lower high end, even things like ring modulators, flangers, anything that's going to give it movement over time to keep your track dynamic and not sounding like every bar is the same. So this is without the phaser. And this is also kind of enhancing the stereo width to 0.06 hertz, so really slow, like with this LFO, and you can kind of hear it bouncing around a little bit. I didn't want it to be too drastic, but I think this really helps both with the stereo image and just give it a little bit different tone. And last but not least, you'll hear in look at this sidechain envelope. This is really bizarre. There's this click at the start of each beat where I guess the kick was taken out of, and I don't like that, so I completely took it out. And then also there's an open hi-hat or something right here, and I wanted to duck it a little bit, and this is very common, so that when the actual open hi-hat is here, you'll hear it. So take a listen to it without the LFO tool. So by doing this, that click at the beginning of each beat is completely gone, and then I'm ducking that open hi-hat so the transient of this open hi-hat can shine through. So it might sound a little sloppy like this, but listen to it in context. Just helps it mesh better, in my opinion. That's this loop. Then we add in this second loop, and those of you who've seen me some of my other videos knows I love using Vice for chopping up these samples. So that's kind of what I've done, is just Vice for this guy, just so that I can then drag the MIDI back in and chop up the loop, or quantize it or change it a little bit. So this is from also the Adam Ellis amplified sample pack. This is loop number 46. Let's take a look at what is going on here. There's quite a bit, so let me turn all this stuff off. So first is what I'm doing is boosting this high-mid information because I felt like this was missing from the percussion. Then what's going on is this phaser, once again adding some more movement. Notice that this is a different rate than the other one, so it's going to be kind of causing this polyrhythmic movement. And that's adding a little bit of stereo field too, just by nature of the phaser. Now it's going through this auto pan, which is set to a pretty low rate, which actually is double the rate of this. That might have just been a coincidence. And this is just going to pan it left and right across the stereo field, just adding a little bit more variation. And last but not least, similar to that other loop, there was this initial click at the beginning of each beat that I wanted to take out, which is what this LFO tool is doing. And that's something you'll actually see on a lot of these different things is with a lot of these loops, it can be helpful to sidechain them. And is what I've done on the bus channel for these loops is I actually have this LFO tool, which is kind of causing this pumping even when the kick is hitting. So without it, this is kind of doing that fake sidechain for the kick anyway. And then all these other loops individually, I'm just taking out that click that was really bothering me. So this is the processing on this group channel, which I'll go over in a minute. Last but not least, let me move to this last and final loop. This is from the Activa Trance Essentials, great pack from Freshly Squeezed Samples. This is the percussion loop from there. And I'm trying to see if I did anything interesting here. I might have just moved some notes around and stuff, but maybe not too much. I might have quantized it around a little bit. I don't think I actually did anything like that. So auto pan and the EQ. Let's take a listen to what this sounds like. So my first notice here, even without this EQ, too much low end. Sometimes you want some of that low end, but I didn't want any of it here. Then I noticed this part here where number 3 was just peaking a little bit too much, and I didn't like it, especially because that's where my open hi-hat is hitting. So listen. So that with the open hi-hat, it sounds a little hollow. Just carving some room for it. And last but not least, this auto pan here, which is just really heavily bouncing this loop to the left and right. Notice how this is actually beat synced to every beat, or every other beat. Once again, to spread it out across the stereo field. And speaking of panning, you'll see each of these, notice how these are all spread out, whether it's from the phaser, a combination of the phaser and the auto pan, or the auto pan itself. And then this percussion I've panned a little bit separately. And you'll see, generally I'll pan my open hat one way. I generally like to do it to the left, and the ride's going to be panned a little bit to the opposite direction, just to kind of help with the stereo field. Now it's important to be sure your tracks are mono compatible. So you want to make sure you're actually still monitoring your track in mono occasionally, so that you're not causing any weird phase cancellations. And I have a lot of stories about that when I first got started producing, where I was using a lot of these stereo enhancement techniques and then my tracks weren't mono compatible. But take a listen to all these loops together. I'll add them kind of each one in, and you can hear it. And of course on the bus channel, it's just a couple things. This Volcano is just doing the role of filter automation throughout the track. So nothing here, but in the intro and outro, it's being filtered in and out. This Mag EQ4 isn't even on, so it's not doing anything. Whereas this guy is just, once again, making sure that there's no low end that's interfering with the sub bass, and then this LFO tool for sidechain. So let's take a listen. This is there for presence boost, and then this is that sidechain. Don't want to take it out all the way. You still want these hits there to be there, but since the kick, in my opinion, is the most important part, you want them to make sure they're out of the way. So let's listen to all this percussion again. And then, of course, in context. And of course, when the sub comes in, we start filtering in this percussion by adding sections, adding new things every 8 bars. Notice how every 8 bars, I'm adding something different. So at first, it's really just the kick and the bass lines. Then we add the closed hats along with with this loop here. Then we add in this loop and the clap. Then we add in finally this loop. And then when the vocals come in, that's when I kind of add that open hi-hat, which really adds a lot. And last but not least, the ride. And kind of doing the exact opposite thing here in the outro, along with this kind of ending part of the drop where we're kind of filtering a lot of these things out. If I open the automation lanes, you can see the low pass cutoff on a lot of these instruments is being automated, the low cut, so when the drop ends, and then we start bringing it back up, you'll really hear this open hi-hat. So anyway, I hope you guys found this helpful. Let me know if you have any questions about percussion and stuff. Otherwise, yeah, I'll see you in the next video.